What's up guys, in this video what I'm going to be discussing are the common oil leaks found on the V-twins, whether it's a Kawasaki or a Kohler. They're found on a lot of residential and commercial mowers. There's 4 areas where they're very common to leak oil, and chances are if you got one of these engines you probably have one of these leaking. Specifically what we're looking at today is a John Deere commercial. It's a Z950M with the Kawasaki FX 850V engine. All right, now like I said, whether it's a Kawasaki or a Kohler, there's 4 main areas that I'm going to show you where it'll be leaking at, and it's all on the same side as the oil filter. So there's 4 different areas that this will leak from, and the oil filter is not one of them. All right, let's just start from the top. This oil cooler right here, you have these hoses. They will eventually crack, deteriorate over time, and that's something you really need to keep an eye on. And what will happen, and it actually happened to another customer with this exact same engine recently, one of these lines busted and it shot out all the oil. They didn't notice it while they were cutting grass, and it ruined their engine. They lost all the oil, and by the time it was still running, but when they brought it in, we put the oil lines on there, we cranked it up, and we realized they had some major internal engine damage. So that's the most critical one that will, once that fails, you know, it will really quickly ruin your engine. And the next one is the oil gasket itself. This is probably the most common. You know, you got some of them don't even have an actual gasket between the oil pan and the rest of the block. Some of them just use a silicone sealant. But with that oil filter right there, you have a lot of pressure, and there's some O-rings. There's 2 O-rings that go through the passageways right there. And usually right here where my light is shining, that's where it'll blow out that seal or blow out that gasket, if it is one that has a gasket, and it will start seeping and you'll get a lot of drip. All right, another one, and I'll show you some footage of this, is this oil pressure switch right here. It will leak through that switch, not necessarily behind on the threads, but it will pass through and start dripping. I'll show you some footage of that. So after about 30 minutes of running, I finally saw a sign of where this oil leak was coming from. It was right through this pressure switch. And then one of the easiest ones to fix is right here, this drain valve. These leak very often, and I'm going to show you kind of how those work. So here's a close-up look at them, guys. So this part right here, you have an O-ring right here. My fingernail there is touching. So you screw it on in to the block, and you have this part right here facing either down or to the side, whichever way you want it. So you screw it all the way in, and then you have this secondary collar right here that is threaded. So then you tighten it up against the block that way. And then right over here is where you remove this. You crack that about halfway and starts letting oil out. But there's also an O-ring inside of here that will fail, and that's what happened with this one. It was actually leaking past this little O-ring here and letting oil drip out right there. But oftentimes you don't even have to replace these. It just may need to be adjusted. So what you need to do is crack this loose from the block where you can turn this, and you may have to just turn it all the way back to where you can rotate this to get it a little bit tighter against the block, and then tighten this down, and that may stop your leak, and that works out a lot of times for me to stop that leak. So recently my customer with this very same motor, he had 2 oil leaks. And like I said, all of these are fairly common. The gasket's very common. These always leak. Very, very common. Yours is probably leaking right now if you got one. And these hoses over time, after a few years, I would say 5 years old, Definitely, they probably need to be replaced. So anyway, he had brought it in and I washed it all off, cleaned it off, and that footage that I showed you, I had evidence of it leaking right there, and I also had it where it was leaking from here, and it was actually leaving quite a bit of an oil spot on the floor. And then about a week later, he calls me and he says, "Hey, I got the oil still leaking. It's just not leaking as bad, but he still has, as you can see, a lot of residue right here." And so, when I changed out, I said, I showed him where it was leaking, the footage I had from it leaking here. And that's one reason I take video of everything, just about, because it's not uncommon for 2 or 3 of these things to be leaking simultaneously. But after I fixed it, I wasn't going to run this thing for several hours. All right, so he ran it for a couple of days before he noticed any other oil leak. And so I said, "Hey, while you're driving it, getting it really good and hot, building up that pressure and that temperature, send me a photo." And so he sent me a photo, and I'm going to show you those photos now. So this is one of the actual photos he sent me, and right there on that left side hose, I could see that little drip right there. So once I saw that photo, it looked like it was leaking from up here. It could still be leaking from right here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash all of this off, and then I'm probably going to just let it run for about an hour or so, because last time it took a long time for me to get it to start leaking from here, and it was steadily dripping from there, but we didn't have all this oil residue around in this area like we do now. So while the engine is cool, I use degreaser and a pressure washer to carefully clean away all the oily residue, and use an air compressor, carb cleaner, air compressor while the engine's running, and I carefully inspect just to confirm exactly where our oil leak is coming from. And after a while, I started to finally see a sign to confirm that it is leaking from the oil cooler hose right there. All right, guys, sorry for all that chaos. I had the exhaust blowing right in my face and trying to find the source. So it looks like that hose is leaking. I don't think the clamp is too weak or anything. It's probably that hose most likely, even though it's going right there where that clamp is. And guys, as I'm getting ready to show you guys how to change out these hoses, it looks like that second hose is also leaking. See that drip right there? I'm zoomed in. All right, guys, so now that we've determined we need to change out these oil coolant hoses, I got the new hoses right here. It's not the easiest job in the world, and I'm going to show you why here in just a moment. But first thing you want to do is take a 10mm and loosen this oil cooler radiator heat exchanger from this shroud. All right, now once you have the mounting bolts removed, you'll notice as you pull it away, you're going to have a little plate like this. So just set that off to the side, and note there's like a little lip there, goes on like that. Now here's the reason I tell you to go ahead and take this loose is these hoses not only have these clamps on, but these studs or the ports that they attach to have those like serrated like flanges on them or whatever. It's extremely hard to remove the hose from them even after you remove these clamps. So what I'm going to do, it's a little unorthodox, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut the hose. We're replacing the hoses, cut it out of here and get those clamps off, and we're pretty much going to have to remove the clamps from the other side from the engine block and almost practically cut the hose away from the ports on the engine block. So what I'm doing right here is just cutting away the little curves in the hose just to make it easier to get that clamp off. These hoses get so hard and brittle, it's just, they will not flex at all. And that just makes it so much easier to slip those clamps off. And now the fun part, I'm going to use my flush cut pliers and just try to carefully cut this hose off of here without damaging the oil tubes. And until you do this, you'll never know how difficult removing these extremely hardened rubber hoses from these tubes will be. And once I get the hoses clean and cleared away from the tubes on the engine block, it's time to start working on the oil cooler. You want to be very careful not to cut into that oil, the tubes on that oil cooler. So guys, let me explain why, a couple of things really. Why it's leaking from the hose and it's not these clamps. All right, one is, I'm not sure if you could tell during that time lapse of just how hard and crunchy, I mean, these things have become insanely brittle, well, hard, in other words. I mean, there's like, I don't know if you guys can hear the crunching. It's just, they crunch. Like the new hose is flexible easily. With my fingers, I can just squeeze it. These here have just like almost become, you can't even, I mean, they're just almost like metal. They're just so hard over time that you can see how, I mean, I'm physically having to, you know, cut away. It's still stuck to this. It's so hard and crunchy. Now, you don't want to, the reason I wasn't sitting here just cutting into that is because I can easily start cutting into this aluminum, and then when I put the new hose on, it could leak that way. All right, so you don't want to sit there and just keep cutting, you know, like this. You need to try not to put any cut marks into this aluminum for this heat exchanger right here. Or basically, it's like a, this is the oil cooler. It's kind of like a radiator, basically. It's a heat exchanger. It's made out of aluminum. It's very soft. So you can cut into it and damage it with a razor blade. All right. Now, the reason we use these types of clamps, or the reason these types of clamps are used, is because they're flexible during thermal expansion, heat, you know, so they'll expand versus the type of clamp. Let me grab one real quick. Clamp like this for that, and you'll notice that these are not used nearly as much as these spring-loaded clamps, and the reason for that is these don't expand. Once you set this, you screw it down, it's there. So as that heat increases and it, you know, and cools off, that heat expands things. All right, these will keep this constant tension, and they can expand a little bit, expand and contract. But the main reason these hoses start leaking is because they just get so hard and brittle over time that they're not spongy. They're not allowed, that clamp gets to where it can't seal it good enough. It can't move, you know, restrict that hose enough around that tube there to keep the oil from leaking past it. It just gets so hard and brittle that the pressure that this clamp creates is not enough. Now, the easy way to install these is first get the clamps, both of the clamps installed on the hose as close to the center of the hose as possible, and then slip them onto the engine first. Then once you get both of the hoses on, move those clamps into position onto the engine, And do this before you install the oil cooler heat exchanger. Now it's really easy just to slip that oil cooler right into position and then work the clamps up. Then you just need to bolt the oil cooler back down to the shroud, and then it's time to take it for a test run. So I decided to get it up to temperature, cut my yard, my neighbor's yards, just to get it up to temperature and make sure that this oil leak is fixed. I probably ran this thing probably 2 hours at least, getting it nice and hot. And this is how she looks, nice and clean, no oil leaks. So guys, I'm gonna wrap up this video on the 4 most common oil leak sources that I see on those V-twin, especially on the commercial mowers, also on the residential mowers, the V-twin engines. If you changed out those oil coolant lines before they get so hardened up, that will make it a lot easier to change. Just change them out every couple of years. It'll make that job much easier. I'll have a video next time. I'll make a video next time I do like a oil pan gasket. I do those pretty frequently, probably once a week or more. It's kind of just, you know, it's not very hard. It's just time consuming, and there's a couple things you need to watch out for. But anyway, do me a favor, hit that like button. That really helps me out with YouTube. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. I'll have more videos like this coming soon, guys. Thanks for watching.